Part of the reason I became a biblical scholar is I just love reading the text and just trying to make sense of the bigger messages behind it. And so I'm kind of old school. I like to print out the text with lots of space, and I get my colored pencils, and I just read it over and over and over and over again, and just try to let it kind of wash over me constantly. So I spent a long time just reading the text in Greek, in English, and letting it just be a part of my world for a year or two. And I did access a lot of secondary literature, but I really just wanted to kind of stare at the face of that text, those texts, for as long as I could, and do what scholars sometimes call a close reading of the text. And my interest, because of the series, was with how these texts give the living voice of Paul to the church today, specifically the global church. So much difficulties that we experience are similar to difficulties that happen in all periods of time. I really wanted to look at those features of those texts. First Thessalonians are about Paul's relationship with a church that essentially he planted in Thessalonica. And it's one of those texts where it helps to know a little bit about what's going on in the church. Paul had to leave that community abruptly, and they've been going through some difficulties, including sudden deaths of members of their church. Situation we don't quite know, but Paul's writing a letter of comfort in 1 Thessalonians, trying to answer some questions about what's going on. They're a church that are perplexed by the signs of the times and what's going on around them. Paul wants to comfort them. 2 Thessalonians carries on from that, and we think that the situation actually got worse. And Paul needs to, again, write another letter to clarify, but also to help them walk through the challenges that they're facing. I hadn't done a ton of study in 1 and 2 Thessalonians when I had been invited to write the commentary, although I'd always been interested in those letters. What I noticed very early on as I began to engage in those texts was you see a different portrait of Paul than many people imagine. We kind of see Paul as a rigid, sometimes cold, calculated theologian, hard-nosed. In Galatians, he comes across angry sometimes. In Romans, he may come across as kind of over-professional. First and Second Thessalonians are a bit different. You see Paul that I like to call off-camera. Paul with, in kind of his more relational self, where we see a tender-hearted, pastoral, warm Paul. For example, he says in 1 Thessalonians, we shared with you not only the gospel, but our very lives. He uses the word psyche, and it almost translates as our deepest, most intimate, vulnerable self that we shared with you. Why? Because you became beloved to us. He fell in love with them. Another, in 2 Thessalonians, he says, pray for us. This is the Paul that's needy. This is the vulnerable Paul. And there's also a place in 1 Thessalonians where he says, we were infants among you, and that's meant to show that vulnerability. This is a pastoral Paul. This is a deeply relational Paul, and I think it helps balance that image we get sometimes of of Paul, the kind of stubborn apostle. 3 times the word wrath comes up in 1 Thessalonians, and we see some of that imagery in 2 Thessalonians as well. And working with students and talking to people in the church, they have this image of a wrathful God that really bothers them. And as I really looked at this word, wrath, orge, in Greek, I came to see that we misunderstand it. We think of wrath as just having a really bad day, just very temperamental, this kind of unbridled rage. But Paul doesn't really communicate it that way. I translate it as God's anger for justice, and maybe even something like God's commitment to justice. He's going to see justice through. And so when Paul talks about wrath, we shouldn't really imagine it as God having a really bad day or God hating people. It's his commitment to justice. And what ends up happening is that Paul communicates that Jesus rescues us from divine wrath, not by working against the purposes of God, but by creating a path for redemption that allows believers to see hope, not against the justice of God, but actually in some way in unison and in tune with that, and working towards God's justice purposes. 1st and 2nd Thessalonians both talk about the importance of honest labor. We often think that the ideal, I remember thinking, that when I was a child, that I wanted to be a talk show host because it seemed like a really easy job. You could just work a couple of hours a day. And we think of Paul, as a theologian. We think theologians, just sit in offices and write books and things like that, and we do some of that. But Paul also talks in 1 Thessalonians about wanting to be a person of integrity, wanting to be a person committed to honest labor, and actually giving a very positive portrayal of manual labor. And one of the things that's really helpful for me about that is it's not wasted time. It's not time away from spiritual things or important things. Paul saw a deep value in working with his hands, in being productive in little things and big things. And also I like that he talks about the importance of, he talks about aspire to live a quiet life. By that, he doesn't mean a hermit. He doesn't mean moving out into the desert or the wilderness. By that, he means don't get caught up in the rat race for success. Do the work because the work is good. I'm not great at manual labor in terms of shoveling and things, but I love cooking. And I don't see it as this sort of meaningless activity just to put a meal. I want to see it as just something good in and of itself that I can enjoy and not get caught up in competitiveness in my work, not get caught up in trying to draw attention to myself. I think that quiet life is enjoying life for what it is and not always looking sideways at what other people are doing and comparing to each other. One thing that's really striking about these letters is the investment that Paul places in family language. This is very important to Paul, especially in 1 Thessalonians. He uses the language of brothers and sisters. We're used to it because we hear it a lot in Christian discourse, Christian language. But that's because Paul, I think, really got this going, that we're family. One thing important about family language is, in the ancient world, you lived by a competitive spirit. You're always competing for honor. And what was understood in that world is you always competed with honor except for people in your family. You never wanted to take honor from them. So by calling each other brothers and sisters, you had to have a change of orientation, that you're wanting to bring honor to your brothers and sisters, not take it away. The other thing that's really striking is Paul uses the word Philadelphia, city of brotherly love, but I like to call it love for siblings. And it's really interesting that in the ancient world, you almost never see instances where this word is used for non-family. We might say, hey bro, can I have some help? But for Paul to apply this word, love for brothers and sisters, to people that weren't actually their brothers and sisters, even worse, to people of other ethnicities, was I would say, unprecedented. And it speaks something important today about treating each other as family and treating each other as people that we are highly invested in, even if we're not related to them. So in the book I say, Paul is blood blind. And we need to realize how radical a notion that is for that time, but also how radical it can be for our time as well.